Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. This leads into this question that's come up about ants and grasshoppers. The pandemic responses that we could typify between these COVID winners and these COVID losers. You could also use Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper. I've said this a few times, right? The ant is industrious, hardworking, preparing for winter, doing the things that are necessary. So when winter comes, was the ant, in Game of Thrones, winter is coming? Maybe, we don't know. But the ant is getting prepared for winter. The grasshopper is listening to music, relaxing, dancing, and not necessarily doing the hard work to be prepared for winter. There's a question that's come up are some of these sort of criteria for reopening, are they shifting goalposts that every time we get close to one, we're just moving it out a little bit and, kind of edging it out? Well, that's one way of a mental model to look at it. I haven't seen many adjustments since earlier mid-March when the hammer and the dance was first proposed and we're looking through like the pandemic panopticon. It's been testing capability, contact tracing, ability to isolate and quarantine infected. It's been standard things, but you can take two mental models, one of which is the goalposts are shifting. They're moving the goalposts on it. And I can understand that because all these different regions in the US are now doing their own thing. They're kind of coming up with their own numbers. But another way to look at it, and I think what's important for us going forward, is that this is like college requirements. The pandemic it's an externality. We're so used to, especially as Americans, being able to use rhetoric, propaganda, rhetorical discussions, negotiate. I want to talk to your manager. I want to talk to my politician. I want to have a protest and institute change, for better or worse, through the institute. We're used to having influence on the things that affect us. The pandemic does not respond to that influence. It's going to do what it's going to do. And so in some ways, these pandemic response are kind of like the requirements of college. You either meet the requirements and you graduate, but if you don't do the work, you don't attend class, you don't prepare for the final, you constantly try and negotiate with your professor, get a better grade, you're not going to graduate from college. You're going to be delayed, assuming you can graduate, you're going to be delayed. And the ones who got out in the workforce sooner, they're going to form networks. There's a gap that's going to appear, just like you could look at those who go to college and flunk out and have debts and sort of, they squander their college opportunity versus those who are able to do the work and graduate. A widening gap appears over time, and we'll definitely see this when we get to unemployment. There's a huge difference between, in the US at least, whether you graduated college or not, or whether you didn't. And I think to the extent when it comes to pandemic response, a better mental model is the pandemic requires certain things to be done to be able to manage and reopen safely and go into what we call the dance, which is your economy's reopen, you're able to continue working, you're able to continue traveling, you're kind of getting back to normal, but it requires certain things to be done, just like graduating college. And if you haven't done those things, you can't avoid the consequences of not having to do them. We are still losing between 1,500 to 2,000 people a day in the United States. It sometimes goes lower. It's oscillating around 1,500. So it's probably between 1,000 to 2,000 with a mean point of 1,500, but that's per day. It's not a discussion of can we reopen? We don't have, we can reopen just fine, but the confidence, the economy is people and confidence. You can't just force people to be confident when they're seeing several thousand people a day die and they're like, I'm not really sure if I want to participate in that, or I don't know to what extent I'm comfortable. Doing the dance activities is like doing the college homework or the college classes. You build the confidence that not only can you've reduced the cases, you've reduced the load, you've reduced the deaths that are coming in, you have the capabilities that create confidence. And one of these key things that I've now found out is the CDC actually created guidance in mid-April, which was a very formal guidance of what would constitute a safe reopening. And this would have been April 17th, 18th. It was rejected by the White House for being too prescriptive. And it actually looks a lot like some of these other countries. You can look at Canada's detailed programs of how to constitute reopening. You can look at Germany, for example, childcare. Phase 1 childcare in many of these things is you allow childcare for essential workers. So rather than allowing the entire workforce to go back in, you recognize that essential workforces are going to need childcare. You're opening up on phase 1, and you're doing it in a phased way. That was actually scratched by the White House in mid-April. So you go back to April and you talk about a lost opportunity. States could have been using a common framework of what constitutes safe reopening. And that builds confidence. It builds confidence in the economy. It builds confidence in employees and workers and business leaders that they know, are we meeting those guidelines? In its absence, the CDC has just now in the last week released sort of updated guidelines, but it's pretty vague. If you go in the comments and the links for this post, you'll see there are links comparing the specific guidance to the current guidance, and it's much less detailed. It's much more notional, and that's kind of like taking a bunch of electives in college and basket weaving and film criticism and stuff like that, instead of taking the hard homework and getting the work done. So I think that in some ways, this effort to sort of not be prescriptive has hurt us because it hasn't given us the confidence or the capabilities to reopen. And I wanted to show that specifically in, we've talked about testing quite a bit. So the current testing numbers are not too bad. The nationwide testing, you talk about homework and meeting your requirements to leave the hammer phase. The nationwide testing, it's 300,000 a day now, probably less than where it needs to be by half. That positive rate's down to about 8 or 9%. That's an improvement. But by way of comparison, Germany, with maybe a third of the population, their testing capability is 1 million. And they're at the point now where they're varying their tests based on what they need. They're not testing 1 million a day. They have that capability, but they may test between 200,000 and 400,000 based off specific. That's what right looks like. But in addition to testing, we also talk about contact tracing. Well, I was finally able to dig up the numbers of what is the necessary amount of tracers to have an effective contact tracing program, and then how are the states performing to it. So I'm using this regional construct here because that's the way we're reopening, to judge what regions are at or approaching the level they need to be. So again, we're going to use per capita numbers. So the non-pandemic recommended tracing level is 15 tracers per 100,000 people. It's a broad number. There's lots of variation and specific nuances, but from a big level standpoint, you can think you need, just in normal conditions for everyday healthcare, probably about 15 people per 100,000 of the population to constitute effective tracing programs. The pandemic recommendation during periods of pandemic is 30 traces per 100,000. So now we have a minimum and an ideal. And we can look at the regions and see how they're doing. So this chart shows, and this is a survey that was done by NPR. They reached out to every state. And what they did is ask, how many tracers do you have now? How many are you hiring? And what this chart represents is the goals that once those people are hired, where will these regions be? So you see here on the left is the tracers per 100,000, 0 to 35. And you can see here the pandemic level is in green. This is the tracing you need during a pandemic. The minimum normal every day is in red. And it breaks out here these regions. These first ones are the unaligned states that are closed at different times. But you can kind of see the states that closed earliest also have the most tracers, whereas the states that closed last have the least tracers. I mean, there's a correlation here of taking things seriously and doing the work that's necessary to get out of the hammer phase of the hammer and the dance. But look at these are the region coalitions here. The Governor's Discussion Group, again, that's Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire. Midwestern States Partnership, that's the upper Midwest, centered around the Great Lakes. The multi-state councils in the New England area, and Southern States Coalition here, and then the Western States back. Now, the never closed, these are the ones in the center of the country. They have a very high number because they have a very low population. So it doesn't take many tracers. But you can look here and see that when it comes to meeting the minimums, the Southern States Coalition isn't even close to the minimum number of normal operations, let alone pandemic. No one's at the pandemic level. The closest is the Multi-State Council, which makes sense. New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts have directly felt the pain of this, so they felt an incentive to get on top of it and get ahead of that. The Western states is just barely past minimum, and the Midwestern's doing a little better. So again, we can begin, these are like grading report cards in college. Do you have the testing sufficiency? Do you have the contact tracing sufficiency? Do you have the isolation and capability? If yes, leave the hammer, go to the dance, reopen the economy, and do so with confidence. And if you look at any of these numbers for Europe, it's a far different question of where they're at. And or not Europe, I shouldn't say that because that gets people confused. The Eastern Europe, Germany anchored, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, look at Canada, look at Australia, New Zealand. They have put in place these capabilities and are measuring well on them. And that's why they have the confidence and ability to reopen. Rory, Hawaii has a rate of change around 2% and began the dance phase on May 8th. Contract cases are in place. Quarantine methods may be expanded to 24-hour negative. Yeah, and you're seeing this as states go into the dance phase. We're going to know how well they do. And again, I think some of the states reopened too soon. If you, ants and grasshopper, if you were a state that took your hammer phase and you didn't put in place the mechanisms, it may be that the dance phase is still going to be a struggle, but it's going to be even more of a struggle if you haven't put in place the work to sort of justify this. It's the classic case of very few things in life work out when you don't work for them. I mean, if things that are hard, college graduation, if you don't put in the effort of going to class, going to see the tutors, doing your papers, doing your homework, staying up on that, getting the test done, if you don't do that and you just show up, and then you're wondering why you're not graduating or why others are graduating sooner, that's the ant and the grasshopper. And I think the pandemic is going to bring that home. So any questions? So Jennifer's asking about Georgia hasn't spiked. I'm looking for, Stefan shared with me earlier, Minnesota had a spike today. It's between now and Wednesday. So I think by Wednesday, if locations spike, we're going to see it in the next 5 days. The reopenings happen, that the increase in infection rate and things like that, if they to happen and if they're to be caught with the testing, should show up between now and the 15th. Yeah, the hard part about this is up until this point, each area has had a time window lag. It came into New York first from Europe, and then it spread from New York to other parts of the country. So New York had it first, then spread to other parts of the country. So there was time differences. Why did Florida happen after New York? It's because New York had to, there had to be a pathway of contagion. Likewise on the West Coast, Washington got hit very early, and then it spread from Washington out from there. But I think as we're now in this sort of later phase, we've nationalized it. Those time windows there may still be certain communities that are, localized or not, but pretty much every state now has active cases, and we're seeing how well they manage it. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.